And this year, we're just so happy to have Dr. Neal Krause, who, aside from all the great stuff that he's done in this particular field, he is one of the world's most distinguished sociologists and methodologists, and really one of the top people that I know in the whole world of social science. Does, I think, the best work of anybody that I've ever known as far as theory and methods and analysis. He's just outstanding. Neal holds an endowed chair at the University of Michigan, where he is the Marshall Becker Collegiate Professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education in the U of M School of Public Health. For over the past 20 years, since I think 93 was his first paper on this topic, somewhere around there, he has been the most prolific researcher as far as grants and publications in the entire field of religion and health. Literally tens of millions of dollars of research funding from the NIH and from Templeton and other folks, and literally hundreds of publications. Plus, he has chaired expert NIH panels, National Institutes of Health panels, foundation initiatives. Whenever there's a handbook or encyclopedia that needs a chapter on the topic, he's the guy that gets the chapter. He's published some of the most important reviews that have been done in this field for years and years and years. He's the real thing. A little bit of background. Neal has a Ph.D. in sociology from the joint program in sociology at Akron and Kent State, and he did a postdoc in Indiana, and he spent some time at Yale. But interestingly, and probably a lot of people that know Neal know his work aren't aware of this, he has very deep roots down in these parts, as the saying goes. Neal actually went to college at OU, where he was a business major, and he got his master's at Sam Houston, and began his academic career at UTMB, at the UT Medical Branch in Galveston. So yes, we are, Byron and I are hosting someone with both OU and UT roots at Baylor, introduced by somebody also trained at UT. So this is quite a scandal, and I guess it's now preserved on film. A bit of a personal note, I have known Neal, as Byron alluded to, for over 30 years. Ever since I was a young doctoral student at the UT Medical Branch. And if I recall, 1984, I did an independent directed readings course with Neal. I've never forgotten this, on power transformations and interaction terms. So any sociologists in here know how enthralling a topic that is. And if I recall, he gave me an A. But the only reason I'm saying all this is because I've spent most of the past 30 years with a gnawing sense that I still owe him a paper. And I'm actually not kidding. And sometimes I wake up in the middle, I have one of those dreams, I'm back in school, and it's like, oh. And I think Neal gave me that grade with the promise that someday I would write a paper using the interactions and transformation. I don't think I ever did. So now I'm outing myself here. So maybe we'll do a paper together. One more thing I want to share about Neal. This is his book came out a few years ago, Aging in the Church, published by Templeton Press. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many other folks, this is the single finest work of research book that has ever been published in the field of religion and health. Chris Ellison did one of the blurbs for it, called it quite simply a tour de force. And Jeff Levin called it a magnum opus, the first and last word on this subject. I think the world of this book. I have assigned this book to my honor students here at Baylor that have had interest in this subject, multiple honor students. And I'm showing it because, given the title of the book, Aging in the Church, How Social Relationships Affect Health, I suspect that today's talk is going to draw on some of the same material. And like a lot of our events, we have a book display set up, a lot of ISR stuff, as well as some of Neal's books. This is really, really, really an exceptional book. It's a research book. This isn't probably bedside reading, but this is the best thing that has ever been done in 30 years on religion and health. So we are really fortunate to get to hear one of the academic world's preeminent social scientists speak to us at Baylor on his research. So please help me welcome my old friend, Dr. Neal Krause from Michigan, who will talk to us on religion and health, exploring the pivotal role of social relationships in the church.
Thank you, Jeff. I don't know what I can do after an introduction like that except fall flat on my face, so let's hope that doesn't happen. I'd certainly like to begin by thanking Jeff and Byron for inviting me here to speak. This is really, truly an honor. I'm very pleased and proud to be here. For about the last 10 or 20 years, I've been looking at how social relationships in religious institutions affect health. And as you can see from the title of my talk today, that's what I'm going to talk about. But before I get started, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the folks who are paying a freight. And that would be the John Templeton Association and the National Institute on Aging. Well, what I'd like to do is, over the course of the hour, I'd like to organize my talk around 4 issues. First, I don't know how much all of you out there know about the field of religion and health. I know it's a very broad field. So because it is, what I'd like to do is just kind of highlight very briefly on what some of the research says. But I'm not going to spend very much time on that at all. And then what I'm going to try to do is convince you that social relationships that people form in religious institutions play a key role in explaining how religion can affect health. And I'm going to come at this from 3 different ways. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about secular social relationships in health. And after that, I'm going to turn to contemporary and classic social and behavioral theorists who tell us that social relationships lie at the very essence of religion. And then finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review some of the studies that I've done. I'm going to touch on about 4 of them. And then after that, what I'd like to do is cast the study of social relationships in the church in an even broader context. You know, the literature on religion and health is really very fragmented. People are saying, no, the real issue is over here, or no, it's over there. Some people say it's religious coping responses. Other people say, no, it's a sense of meaning that arises from being involved in religion. And what I'm going to try to convince you about is that all of these mechanisms share a common conceptual core, and that common conceptual core is social. And what I'm going to try to maintain is that all of these arise and are maintained or fed by social relationships that arise in the church. And then after doing this, I'm going to turn to my new research agenda, which I'm just beginning to roll out. And what I want to know is, what role do virtues play in the maintenance and transmission of good social relationships? So then if I were to view this thing very broadly, I'd say I'm going to propose a causal sequence, and I'm certainly going to put causal in quotations, that begins with religious virtues, that runs through social relationships in the church and other mechanisms, and ends up predicting health. So let me take it from the top. What is the notion of religion and health? Where does all that come from? And the answer is, it's very old. Augustine, Confessions, 400 Common Era. You guys, I'm sure, are all familiar with Augustine, right? Well, I pulled this little gem out of it. I actually read this book. As it says there, it tortured me to read it. I didn't really care for it. But anyway, God tortures him with a toothache, and he can hardly speak. So he says to his colleagues, let's all pray that my pain be gone. And they did, and lo and behold, guess what? No more pain. Well, I like that story, because you know why? Look at the social aspects of it. Did he pray for it? Did he pray for himself? No, he actually had some help from his friends there. 1872, Francis Galton did a first empirical study that looked at the relationship between religion and prayer and longevity, actually. Well, more recently, there's been a flood of research. And if you guys want to get a good introduction to it, a good place to look is Harold Koenig's book. It's in the 2nd edition. It's the Handbook of Religion and Health. And he says between 2000 and 2009, 3,000 original quantitative studies appeared on religion and health. That's amazing, 3,000. And I would say it's still growing. What does all that work suggest? Well, it says basically that people who are more involved in religion tend to enjoy better physical and mental health than people who are not involved in religion. Well, does that prove then that religion affects health? Come on, being good social scientists, we can't ever say it's proven, right? I don't think so. I think the only way you can prove things in our line of work is through studies that employ experimental designs. But unfortunately, you can't fit a congregation in a small group's lab. So how do we move things forward? And the answer is, I believe, in a word, theory. Kurt Lewin, famous social psychologist, said there is nothing as practical as a good theory. So more recently, people who I actually spent some time reading the philosophical literature on how you prove causality. And the line of thinking now is that along with meeting some other criteria, you have to provide a compelling theoretical argument for the relationships that you see. So theory lies right at the heart of causality. Well, my own theoretical orientation begins, I think, with a very simple premise, and that is that the health-related benefits of religion, if there are any, arise in part from the social relationships that people form in places where they worship. Well, why would I place such a big emphasis on social aspects of religion? You know, I'll begin to answer this question by turning to a very large body of research. It's even bigger than religion and health. And this is on what I'll call secular social relationships in health. Now, what do I mean by secular social relationships? It's an odd term. What I mean is that when they ask questions in a research setting, they don't care where the social support is exchanged, and they don't care who gives it to you or who you give it to. They just ask, think back over the past year, how often have your family members and close friends provided you with support? That would be a secular social supports question. Now, let me summarize the literature, and I'll do it by turning to a quotation from a colleague of mine at Michigan, Jim House. And he wrote this in 1988, but it did appear in the journal Nature. And those of you who know the pecking order of journals know this is like getting your picture on the cover of the Rolling Stone, right? And what he said was that the adjusted relative risk ratios for research on social relationships and mortality are stronger than the relative risk for all-cause mortality for cigarette smoking. Is that a kick in the head? Here's somebody else that says basically the same thing except later in the American Journal of Public Health. And these people looked at the data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. And they were interested in social isolation and health. Well, to me, social isolation is just the absence of good social relationships. So I think it fits in with what I'm talking about today. And they say that the strength of social isolation as a predictor of mortality is similar to other well-documented clinical risk factors. And among the clinical risk factors they had in mind were high blood pressure and cigarette smoking. Wow. Think about this. Why is this a big deal? It's a big deal because WHO said that 10 million people are going to die from cigarette smoking in the year 2030. 10 million. Think about the public health implications of people's social relationships. Okay, but so far I've just talked about secular social relationships. How do you bridge over to social relationships in religious institutions? And I believe, and my work is going to suggest, that maybe, and again, underline the word maybe, but maybe social relationships in the church actually have a more beneficial effect than social relationships in the wider secular world. Now, the first step I'm going to take to try to convince you this is true is by turning to the work of classic social theorists. And one person that comes to mind is James Mark Baldwin. He was an early president of the American Psychological Association. And if you could see what he says here, that no man is religious by himself, nor does he choose his God, nor devise his offering, nor enjoy his blessings alone. George Simmel, classic sociological theorist. What does he say? The faith that's come to be regarded as the essence of religion is a relationship between human beings. And this is, the emphasis was in his original work. Well, these are by no means the only people who say this. In fact, if you move forward in time to contemporary social theorists, you can find pretty much the same thing. I know a lot of you are familiar with Peter Berger's book, The Sacred Canopy. And in this book, he talks about where do religious worldviews come from and how are they maintained. And here's what he's got to say about it. He goes, they're on social processes constantly reconstruct and maintain these religious worldviews. Okay, well, let's stop for a second and see where we are. Research in secular settings says that social relationships have a profound effect on health. Social and psychological theorists say that social relationships lie at the heart of religion. So if religion is associated with health, then it makes sense to say, couldn't the social relationships in religious institutions have something to do with this? Well, this is all based on theory, and theory is good, but you're going to say to me, Neal, where is the empirical beef? We want to see something that can really convince us more that this is true. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to a series of studies that I've done. The first two were done in 2006. And here's the citation for this one. This study deals with something that I'll call church-based social support. Now, what do I mean by church-based social support? That would be informal assistance, which is exchanged among fellow church members for the explicit purpose of helping them deal with adversity. Okay, well, church-based social support, I think, is important for the following reason. You know, all of you have seen the discussions in the literature about what are the functions of religion? Why are people religious? What do they do this for? And certainly on everybody's list is religion helps people deal with stress and adversity. I think if you flip through the Christian Bible even casually, it reads like a manual for dealing with stress. You can look at the stories about Job for an example. Well, the essence of this view was captured 80 years ago by Charles Horton Cooley, who just happens to be a good Michigan man. And he says that religion exists without our being aware of it until some crisis brings it out. Until some crisis brings it out. I thought that's really kind of neat. You know, what does he mean, until some crisis brings it out? And I think what he means is that when people are faced with adversity, they have options. They try to deal with it in some way. And there's a lot of ways that people can do it. But I think that a number of people, when they're faced with adversity, turn to their fellow church members for assistance. But you say, well, we all know that people do this in the secular world. When people run into stress, they talk to their wife, they talk to, who knows else, and it's not within the context of religion. So why would receiving help during times of adversity be beneficial to people who are involved in religion? And I think there's at least two reasons why I think religion performs a unique stress buffering function. And the first has to do with shared beliefs that people have about the nature of stress and suffering. And this comes from Chris Ellison's work. And he says that people work in the same congregation, have a shared set of values and beliefs. And a good deal of this is related specifically to stress. And they have similar views about why pain and suffering exist in the world. And these beliefs may specify, for example, that God has a reason for the difficulties and adversities we face. And that perhaps, and not everyone believes it, but perhaps it's an opportunity for personal growth and development. But perhaps, and I think even more important, these beliefs lead to shared religious coping responses. Now, coupled with this, I think, and this is what makes, again, religious support unique, is that people have strong religious motivation in congregations for helping each other. The participants in my study were, in the work that I do, are Christians. And as you know, this faith tradition encourages a number of beliefs and behaviors, but one of them is the virtues of loving others, helping people who are in need, and forgiving people for the things that they've done. And moreover, the help is taught to be non-judgmental and given without any expectation of receiving anything in return. Here's another issue that I think highlights the value of social support in religious institutions. When you read the secular literature on social support, it sounds like everybody, who runs into difficulty goes out and just easily requests support from their family members and friends, and they gratefully acknowledge it, and everything is great. Well, John Eckenrode wrote a good literature review on this, and he says, this doesn't happen. Many times the stressors that face people are stigmatizing and embarrassing. And other times, people can be the architects of their own misfortunes. They create the problems. So to have to go out and ask for assistance under those is pretty tough. But I think the environment of the church provides a trusting environment, a trusting interpersonal environment that makes it easier to reach out to fellow church members in times of difficulty. So, what does this say? It says that maybe, just maybe, receiving support from people in religious institutions is more efficacious than receiving assistance from people who are outside religious institutions. And my study was designed to address this directly. So let me turn to some technical issues in the study. And I don't want to get into a lot of stat stuff today. I certainly know it, but I prefer to keep this on a conceptual level as much as possible. Here's an overhead about my study. This has been going on since 1992. Although the first wave didn't get conducted to 2001, I actually spent 3 years doing qualitative research, and we kind of talked about this at dinner last night. But anyway, 66 years of age and over, 1,500 people, response rate 60%. We're now got 5 waves of interviews, and I'm out there sniffing around for money to get wave 6, so we'll see if I can get lucky. The sample had equal numbers of older blacks and older whites. The data for this first set of analysis come from the second wave of interviews, and that's because all the measures I needed weren't available till then. In fact, let me just kind of talk to these, speak to these measures right now. You know, you say people turn to others for assistance. What does that mean? You can get all different kinds of assistance. We know from the social support literature you can get emotional support, you can get tangible help, you can get information from other people that will help you understand difficult situations. I'm going to look at emotional support, and I'm doing this for 2 reasons. One is that, to me, in my view, emotional support is universal. No matter what problem you've got, nothing hurts having somebody put their arm around you and tell you it's going to be all right. You know, and I think that's important. And then I think, in contrast, if you look at tangible and informational support, they're not they're useful, but in only more limited sets of circumstances. Here's some measures. This is what I wanted to do to get at informal emotional support. And if you look at this, this is how I set it up so I could compare support in the church versus support outside the church. And the top one, obviously, is for church-based support. So everything is the same in these question stems. The only thing that differs is the instructions to how often to people, fellow church members in your congregation, give you emotional support is pretty much what that's all about. Now, in terms of stress, what I wanted to look at was financial strain. How much difficulty do you meet paying your monthly bills? And then this is actually just one question from a wider scale. And then health was measured with self-rated health. And I think a number of you are familiar with this. This is probably one of the most widely used health questions in the literature. How would you rate your overall health at the present time? I mean, this thing has been around for a very long time. And I looked at this thing controlling for a number of different dimensions of religion and controlling for a bunch of demographic factors and things like that. Now, gotta stop and talk. One little easy stat point here. When we say that social support helps people deal with the effects of stress, we're talking about something called a statistical interaction effect. And what that means is that at progressively higher levels of social support, stress should have a progressively weaker effect on health. That's the thing we want to keep our eye on. Here's coefficients. What do we see? Well, the top one you can see is church-based support in times of financial strain significantly offsets the effects of those economic difficulties on health. But if you look at the second row, the coefficient for secular support is not statistically significant. So what this is telling us is that maybe there's something unique about emotional support that's received from fellow church members. Well, it might be a little hard for you to see. You say, well, what do you mean it becomes progressively weaker at progressively higher levels of social support? Well, there's a way to do this. You can just kind of say, I'm going to calculate the effects of financial strain on health at different levels of social support. And I just picked 3. And this is what's in this overhead. At 1 standard deviation below the mean, you can see self-rated health is a high score means good health, financial strain, high score is bad. So you can see the very strong inverse relationship between the two. And that's among people who get relatively less social support from their fellow church members. What about at the mean? Well, you can see that financial strain still has an effect on people's self-rated health. But look at the difference in the 2 coefficients. It's starting to get weaker, right? Now look what happens at 1 standard deviation above the mean of emotional support from fellow church members. What do you see there? You see that the effect is weaker still. So let's think, there's 2 things that I want to point out about this particular set of analyses. First, emotional support from fellow church members offsets the effects of financial strain on health, but not completely. it reduces it 67%, which ain't bad. But it's not, you're still feeling it, and that makes sense to me. Nobody likes to be in a situation where they don't have any money. Okay, second, there were major race differences in this, but I don't want to get into that now. But the thing that I want to emphasize is the bottom line is this. There is some suggestive evidence which makes me think that there's something unique about social support in religious institutions. Well, this is beginning to tell us what's going on, and I think that's helpful, but it doesn't go far enough. There's many different ways that people can engage in the social support process in church or in synagogue or wherever. And so far I've just talked about the emotional support that people receive from the people they worship with. But I'm also interested, and I also did some work, on what about the social support they give to the people they worship with. You know, there's a big line of theory in sociology called social exchange theory. It says that, you know, people always give with the understanding that they'll get something back in return. And so I want to look at the given side of this. And this kind of sets up, to me, kind of a classic religious question, right? And that is it better to give or to receive? Right? Why not? I mean, you know, if we can't ask the big questions, right, who can? Okay, here's the citation for this study. This also appeared in a journal of Gerontology. I'm going to set the study up by talking about three issues. I'd like to talk about why is it important to help other people? What's the big deal? And then the next thing I'd like to do is to show how support providers, when you give support, you benefit yourself. You help the person you give it to, but you as a support giver also get some benefits. And then what I'll try to show is why providing support to others, then what I'm going to do is use this empirical data that I've got to give a preliminary test of this notion. Is it better to give than to receive? Well, let's think about why it's important to give. For centuries, key religious figures have been telling us that it's better to give than to receive. Obviously, Jesus said a lot about it, but here's what John Calvin had to say about it. Right? All endowments we possess are entrusted to us for the purpose of giving them to our neighbors. Right? Very unambiguous statement. Okay? But that's just the first one. Here's another one. Albert Schweitzer. You know, in addition to being a Nobel laureate, this was one deeply religious man. I've actually spent a lot of time reading his stuff. He is very good. He was one of the classic people that was good at a lot of different stuff. He was a master organ, you know, church organ builder and things like that. Incredible, just incredible. Here, look what he says. One can save one's life as a human being, right? If one seizes every opportunity to help those who are in need. That's basically what he's saying. Look at the first clause of that. I think that's really cool. One can save one's life as a human being. Wow, doesn't that say something about the support giver and the benefit that the giver has in helping somebody? I think so. Here's another one. This is a real classic piece. I drive my students nuts in my classes. I always interject all kinds of different sources. This is Alexander Pope, 1731, an essay on man. Some consider this to be the most explicit of discussion of human nature that's out there. And look at that. The language is kind of heavy duty, but what do you expect for 1731? But there's 3 points in there that they're pretty interesting. First, he says, people are by their very nature dependent upon others. Right? That's what the first thing says. Second, people can't live without both receiving and providing support. But look at the last line in that. Support providers, by helping others, can grow stronger themselves. Okay, well, you know, as all the grand masters, you know, you read that stuff and you say, that's a good idea. But there's not enough meat on it. What do you mean that a support provider can benefit themselves from helping others? And here we've got to, again, move forward in time to the mid-1960s. And I'm going to talk about a social worker named Reisman. And he said, here's 3 reasons why helping others will benefit you as a support provider. And here's what he had to say. He says, look, first off, helping people is going to build the self-esteem of the support provider. Because in American society, and certainly in religious institutions, a premium is placed on helping people who are in need. But there's another little twist in this too that's really important, and that is during stressful times, what happens to you? Depending upon the nature of the stressor, your self-esteem can go down. You've lost your job. That's not a self-esteem booster, right? So if you can help somebody when you yourself are facing difficulty, it's going to raise your self-esteem, according to Reisman. Second thing, Reisman says, you know, if you look at the social support process and you see people being helped from it, it can only help you but wonder, maybe my own problems can be helped with assistance from significant others. Maybe I can regain a sense of control over my problem situation. And this is important because your sense of control is also eroded by stress. But here's the third thing he had to say, and I like this one a lot. He says, when you help others, it gives you a temporary respite from your own problems. Now, what does that mean? You know, when you're facing difficult times yourself, many times, your focus is all me. Oh, I'm hurting. Oh, this has gone wrong. Why did this happen, right? And I think thinking about yourself too much is not a good thing. Bernice Newgarden was a famous gerontologist, and she said that as people get older, she said they seem to be more preoccupied with themselves. So what Reisman is really saying is that when you help others, it kind of pulls your focus off yourself. You get a little temporary respite from your own troubles, and this is a good thing. Well, I'd add something else, and it's a little bit more complicated, but I think it's true and I think it's there. If you think about it, virtually all the major religions in the world emphasize the need to help others. So it's codified into the norms of many religious traditions. Well, why are norms important? Well, norms are important because they tell people what to do and what to expect. They provide a basis for evaluating the adequacy of a person's own behavior, and they give them a sense of direction and purpose and meaning in life. And I think that when you help others, it increases your own sense of meaning in life. And work that I've done and other people have done have shown that a sense of meaning in life is related to better physical health, better mental health, and even a reduced odds of dying. So, getting all the way back to my second study then, what I wanted to do was I wanted to see if helping others has a more beneficial effect during stressful times than receiving support from others. But I wanted to build in a little twist to this. And the twist is this, it carries over from the first study. The first study I just showed you said receiving emotional support from fellow church members reduces the effects of stress on health. I want to look at both of those simultaneously. Put them up and say, okay, is it better to give or is it better to receive? And the data I got are again from my nationwide study. I looked at the data from Wave 1 and Wave 2. Wave 1 was gathered in 2001. Wave 2 was gathered in 2004. Now, if you remember the earlier overhead that I showed you, everybody's 66 years of age and over. Guess what happens between 2001 and 2004? A lot of people died. In fact, 208 people died. Well, that's very unfortunate for them and their families. For us as researchers, hot dog. This is going to give us a really good opportunity to see if we can use that Wave 1 data to predict who's dead at Wave 2. And what I really like about that is there is no ambiguity about the direction of causality, right? So that also is a good thing. So 208 people died. So the measures I looked at again were solely receiving and providing emotional support to others. And this overhead contains a couple items to give you an idea of how they were measured. And again, you can just see that they're the same, except did you give it or did you receive it? Then my measure of stress is financial stress, your own personal financial difficulty. Same measure I had before. Okay, and then I controlled for a number of other mentions of religion and self-rated health and demographic variables and all the rest of that. Let me cut right to the chase. Here's how I did the study. First, I looked at just receiving emotional support by financial strain on mortality. And then I looked separately at providing emotional support and financial strain and mortality. And here's what the data show. When they're looked at separately, both of them reduce the odds of dying. So in other words, the more support you receive from fellow church members reduces the effects of financial strain and mortality, and giving social support to others reduces the effects of financial strain and mortality. But the real kicker is what happens when I put them together. And the answer is right up there. Receiving is no longer statistically significant. Giving is. So, bottom line, what's going on here? Again, it's a statistical interaction effect. So what I did was to illustrate this for you, I just computed the odds of dying at the lowest level of social support and the highest level of social support provided to others. As you can see, look at that. If you don't get you get virtually no social support from the people at church, look at the effects of that on your odds of dying. 85% increase. Wow, that's right up there. Now you see why House is talking about cigarette smoking, right? Here's the odds of dying among the highest. Not statistically significant. If I help others during my own financial times of difficulty, it benefits me, myself. It lowers my odds of dying. Well, where are we so far? Social relationships are very important. They're important in the secular world, and they're more important, or could be more important, in religious settings. Not only that, but it looks like giving support may be better than receiving it. But wait a minute. What did I say earlier? There's all these other mechanisms out there. People are telling me it's religious coping, it's meaning, it's this, it's that. How do I know that this whole business about exchanging social support in religious institutions is all that important? What I'm going to do is I'm going to just bring out a list of about 5 or 6 mechanisms that people have mentioned in the literature that say this is why religion's related to health. And I'm just going to define them a little bit, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to argue that social relationships in the church lie at the basis of every one of those. Now, I can't go through all 5, but what I'm going to do is pull out one and give you a little more detail to make this more real to you. Okay, so what do we got? First on the list, religious coping responses. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this. You had Ken Pargament here. He must have talked about that. This is a specific behavioral and cognitive practices that people engage in when they're confronted by stressful situations. Ken Pargament's R-COPE inventory, 105 items, is the best one in the business. It deals with stuff like, I ask for God's help. I try to view the stressor as being part of God's broader plan for me. Lo and behold, his research shows that the more religious coping responses you use, the more likely you are to avoid the deleterious effects of stress. Well, there's another one that I've worked with a little bit. It goes under different names. It's called God-mediated control. And it means working collaboratively with God to either solve problems in life or to reach goals, desired goals and ends. And when I put together a measure like this, one of the items I had reads like this: all things are possible when I work together with God. And what my research has shown is a strong sense of God-mediated control is related to better physical and mental health. Now, the third mechanism that people have talked about in literature is a religious sense of meaning in life. I know you've seen the work of Ralph Hood, and he mentions that he discusses the functions of religion, and he mentions that one of them is a better sense of meaning in life. Well, this is a notoriously difficult construct to define. What is the meaning? How do you define a sense of meaning in life? Well, most people would agree it's having a sense of purpose and having a sense of direction. And I devised a short scale for this, and one of the items is God put me in this life for a purpose. Got a sense of meaning, direction. My own work, as well as the work of other people, has shown that religious meaning in life is associated with better physical health, better mental health, and lower odds of dying over time. Fourth intervening mechanism, forgiveness. I know a lot of you have seen forgiveness literature. A lot of it's done on forgiving others. And a large body of research suggests that forgiving others could be good for your physical and mental health. And the last one is prayer. People say that prayer is associated. You saw that in the overhead that I gave you from Augustine's Confessions. Well, why bring up this long series? What is my point? Over the years, I've conducted a series of longitudinal analyses which suggest that the social relationships that people have in church are associated with more frequent use of religious coping responses, stronger sense of God-mediated control, stronger sense of meaning in life, greater practice of forgiving others, and a whole range of different measures of prayer. Well, I say, oh, that's nice, Neil, you can rattle off this list of studies, but show me, how does that work really? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to a study I did in 2004. And this shows the relationship between social relationships in the church and the use of religious coping responses, but over time. This brings in some of my longitudinal data. Here's the model that I used. Race was part of this, but I want to pick this up downstream when we go from a church sense. So what I try to do is, I don't know if it's showing up, but I try to put the key linkages in there in heavier arrows. But anyway, what am I arguing in this? And what I'm going to do is tell you what the argument is, and then I'm going to go back and define terms and things like that. What I'm saying is more frequent, people go to church more often, are more likely to find they believe their congregations are cohesive. People that worship in more cohesive congregations receive more spiritual support, and people who receive more spiritual support are more likely to engage in religious coping responses. That's the kind of the guts of this. But let me talk about what I mean by things like congregational cohesiveness and spiritual support. Congregational cohesiveness refers to whether people in a congregation have a shared set of values, whether they have a similar outlook on life, whether they believe they have common views about where their congregation is headed. Now, spiritual support is one that I like because it's unique to religious institutions. It's one that I wanted to bring to the foreground for reasons that I'm going to use down the road a little bit. But this is informal support that's exchanged among people who worship together. But the sole purpose of this is to increase and bolster the religious beliefs and behaviors of that fellow church member. Okay, well, let me talk about why these things are related like this. Very simply, the first hypothesis, people go to church more often, believe that they have more common, people in their congregation have more common values and beliefs, rests on the very simple notion that, in order to find out people's beliefs, you've got to get in contact with them. What do they believe? What are the things that they get into? And I think regular church attendance is certainly an example of that. Of that. Second hypothesis, congregational cohesiveness leads to more spiritual support. So far, I've talked about the good things in church and places of worship about social relationships. But when I did my qualitative work, I found out, guess what? These people fight like cats and dogs sometimes. The congregations are rife with conflict, not all the time, but it does happen. So what kind of environment is likely to support an environment where people give and receive more social support? And I think a cohesive church environment is more likely to do that. And it just comes off the homophilic principle, which says that support is more likely to be exchanged when there's a high degree of consensus among values and beliefs in people in a group. Okay, third hypothesis gets right down to the crux of the issue. Why is spiritual support associated with religious coping responses? And in order to see this, I want to turn to two factors. One of them comes from a psychiatrist, Gerald Kaplan. Those of you who may not know him, he was the founder of the community psychiatry movement. And he wrote some really good pieces on stress and how stress affects people. And he said that one of the keys is that stress is so noxious because it erodes the very problem-solving abilities you need to get past it. And if you think about it, stress can knock you for a loop, makes you disoriented, makes you uncertain about what's going on. So when this happens, you turn to significant others for assistance. And here's what Gerald Kaplan has to say. Significant others aid the person in evaluating the problem situation. They help them set up a plan. They assist them in implementing the plan. They provide feedback and guidance as the plan is going on. To this, I would simply add that spiritual support does this on the basis of religious principles. Okay, well, let me return to my study model again, because there's one thing I want you to look at. This is done with the effects of spiritual support on religious coping responses, wave 1, religious coping responses, wave 3. I used wave 1 and 3 because I didn't have religious coping responses at wave 2. But this allows me to address two issues, and it allows me to get a sense of the dynamics of spiritual support. Spiritual support leads to religious coping at wave 1. That's what they call a contemporaneous effect. What that means is that it doesn't take long. I can give you some assistance, and it doesn't take long for the benefits of that assistance to show up. The second one is spiritual support to religious coping, but at wave 3, which is further down the line. And that's what they call a lagged effect. And I view that in this context as allowing you to maintain that sense of and use of religious coping responses over time. Okay, well, let me talk about the mechanics of the study real fast. Here's how I measured congregational cohesiveness. And again, I didn't just, there were no such measures like this. I found out these constructs when I was studying and doing my qualitative studies. And I feel like my beliefs and values are shared by most of the people in my congregation. Most of the people in my congregation tend to have a similar outlook on life. Here's how I assessed spiritual support. How often does, and I wanted to make this a focus on informal. So I said, not counting Bible study groups, prayer groups, or church services. How often does someone in your congregation help you find solutions to your problems in the Bible? How often do they help you live according to your religious beliefs? Okay, well, let's see what we've got at this point. Very simply, here's what the findings show. Here's religious coping, I'm sorry. I look to God for strength in a crisis. I look to God for guidance. These are some of the items I use to measure this. I use a longer scale. Here's the main finding. This is what I want to get to. People who worship in highly cohesive congregations get more support, spiritual support. More spiritual support, and this is the last two that are the most important. More spiritual support is associated with greater use of religious coping responses at time 1 and at time 3. So it has both lagged and contemporaneous effects. Where are we? Social relationships lie at the heart of religion. Church-based social relationships are associated with health and mortality. Church-based social relationships shape many other mechanisms involving religion. In the case I just tried to make, religious coping responses. Okay, but if you listen very closely, I was a bit unclear about the type of social support that's at the key here. On the one hand, I was telling you providing support to others is good. And on the other hand, I'm telling you receiving support, spiritual support from others is good. Well, come on, which is it? And the answer is, I think it's both. But I think they enter the causal process at different points in time. And that's what I'd like to do for the rest of the time I've got, is to turn to my new research agenda on virtues to show you how this might work. And I want to deal with work that I haven't published yet. I've analyzed the data, but I just haven't written it up. So let me start at the beginning. Why bring virtues into the picture? What has that got to do with any of this? Well, a while ago, I defined spiritual support as the assistance that people give us with the specific purpose of adopting religious teachings and principles. But I never really defined what those religious teachings and principles were. Well, I'm going to now. I'm going to say that they have something to do with virtues. Part of what's embedded in religious teachings are principles of virtuous behavior. But I want to add one last wrinkle to this. I want to focus on specific kinds of virtues, virtues that are social in nature. And many virtues are. Just before I left to come down this weekend, I was reading a piece that said, if I remember this correctly, 6 of the 10 commandments are interpersonal. They deal with social things, right? They deal with how we relate to other people. Well, a lot of virtues do. In a more contemporary view, this is the work of Roy Baumeister and Julie Exline. And they say that virtues are moral traits that are basic, their sole purpose is to facilitate social relationships. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on 3 in this final set of analyses: humility, compassion, and altruism. Not going to talk about or define humility and compassion, but I would like to talk about altruism a little bit. There's no good definition of it, but I consider it to be a behavior that's intended to improve the situation of another rather than the situation of the self. Just define it simply. It's something that I do to help somebody else with no benefit for me. Why would I consider altruism in this context? I think that helping other people, providing support to others, is an instance of, or a type of, altruistic behavior. Well, if you agree with these conclusions, then it's not hard to see why spiritual support and providing support to others are both important, and they just help each other at different points in time. To help you see that, I'm going to go to one last model. And here's the core hypotheses that lie in this. You go to church more often, you get more spiritual support. You get more spiritual support, you're more humble. You're more humble, you're more compassionate. And if you're more compassionate, you're more likely to engage in altruistic behaviors. Well, why would I put together that series of hypotheses? What links them all together? I think that the first one is very straightforward. If you want to get spiritual support from the people at church, you got to go to church. Contact is necessary to receive support. But it's the second one that starts getting closer. So if people get more spiritual support, why are they more humble? And I think this rests on 3 points. First, every major religion in the world, and I've got a book by a guy named Lundberg that kind of lays this out. Every major faith tradition in the world extols the virtue of being humble. If spiritual support is defined as providing and encouraging others to embrace religious principles, and humility is one of them, then maybe that's what spiritual support does. Second reason for thinking that spiritual support leads to humility and why humility is important comes from the work of Augustine. People said, how would you live a virtuous life? And I think some of you have probably seen this before. The first part is humility, the second part is humility, and the third part is humility. You keep asking me, and I'll keep on giving you the same answer. That's essentially what he's telling us there. So if spiritual support places an emphasis on religious teachings, and humility is one of the most important religious teachings, at least according to Augustine, then guess what? People that get more spiritual support are likely to be more humble. Fourth reason why spiritual support may be related to humility is, I think, when people are not humble, they're proud. When they're proud, their minds are closed. They're less receptive. Spiritual support opens a person's mind by making them more receptive, not only to humility, but to the other virtues as well. Why are people who are more humble more compassionate? I think that when a person is humble, they recognize that they have flaws and weaknesses. They also recognize that other people have flaws and weaknesses as well, and that makes them sympathetic. Ironically, one of the best statements of this comes from Bertrand Russell, who was anything but a religious man. Right? And here's what he has to say. Let us remember they're fellow sufferers in the same darkness, actors in the same tragedies as ourselves. But there are other social psychological reasons why people who receive, people who are humble are more compassionate. I think the humble person doesn't need distance and reduction strategies. They don't need to run down others just to keep an unrealistically high sense of self-appraisal. Rather, they are more likely to make less biased and more compassionate views of others. Okay, final hypothesis, compassion and helping others. I think wanting to help people is a good thing. Feeling compassion is a good thing. But the real benefits aren't going to happen unless you carry those beliefs into actions. You can talk the talk, but you got to walk the walk, basically. And in order to understand this relationship, I think it's important to remember that people who are more compassionate are better support providers. Why would that be so? Well, the literature is full of references to misguided helping and people that want to help but somehow it doesn't work out. The social support process is just very fragile. It can easily go awry. The right kind of assistance must be given at the right time and in the right way. And I think that entering the mind of another sympathetically is the only way you're going to do that. So what does that mean then? I think compassionate people are more likely to be good support providers because they can enter the mind of another sympathetically. So that's the guts of what I'm doing. And this data came from the 5th wave of interviews, which were done in 2013. We just completed them a little while ago. And I didn't have measures of many of the other things in the model that I had up there to test, so until this wave of interviews. So let me run through the core measures. Here's humility. These are pretty well known. This came from Peterson and Seligman's work. I did some qualitative work and revised many of these. These are the indicators that I used for compassion. And this came also from the literature, but again, I revised them. Here's emotional support provided to family members and friends. Pretty straightforward indicators. Substantive findings, what do we find? More frequent church attendance is associated with greater spiritual support. More spiritual support is associated with greater humility. Greater humility is associated with more compassion, and people who are more compassionate provide more emotional support to others. Let me kind of begin to wrap this thing up with just an overview of what is it that I've been trying to tell you today. I'm trying to tell you that religion is associated with better health. Some people think that. The church-based social support may have something to do with it. The church-based social support is more effective than secular social support, and that it's better to give than to receive. And that church-based social relationships can drive many of the other mechanisms that people have used to explain why religion and health are associated. And that church-based social relationships are a conduit for transmitting religious virtues. And religious virtues shape helping behaviors. Okay, well, I think the last step in what I want to talk about today is something that really gets to the heart of the matter for me. For those of you who know your New Testament, you know in the Gospel according to Luke, the Pharisees demanded of Jesus, where is the kingdom of God? When is it going to come? And if you read the King James Version of the Bible, he says, behold, the kingdom of God is within you, right? You guys all know that quote, right? It's famous. But Martin Luther had a different interpretation. He was a master of Greek and Latin. And he said, nope, that's not the way it should be. It's, behold, the kingdom of God is in the midst of you. Very interesting translation. What does it do? Well, by the way, he was not the only guy to say that. George Albert Coates, one of the early psychologists of religion, also translated that the same way. And when I was at Duke doing a talk a while back, I talked to the guys in the theology school, and they told me, yep, that was a hot debate for a long time about the interpretation of that. But I just want you to think about what that means. It takes the whole notion of what religion is out of the internal psychic stuff. Remember William James talked about religion? What did he say? It kind of comes up, bubbles up from the unconscious mind. It takes it out of all that and says, no, it's here in the middle of a higher order social phenomena. It's here in the midst of you. And what this really says to me is that heaven at least can be in the here and now. It's not some abstract thing. It's something that we can construct together as people. So viewed more broadly, I hope you see why I study social relationships in health and why I focus on social relationships in religious institutions and health. And well, I hope you found my views to be plausible and interesting, and I'm going to stop and I'm going to throw the field open for comments, hopefully not too many criticisms, and questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Does your study address the different types or the congregations, ones that are more apt to be more social amongst themselves, whereas the others that are more reserved?
I looked at that in terms of denominational differences, and there are some actually very significant ones. The Catholic Church, no offense, but I'm just telling you what the data says, tends to be less, people feel they get less support in the Catholic Church, as opposed to conservative Christian churches where people feel they get more support. So are there more or less supportive things? Yeah, I think denominational affiliation is one thing. Is it the only thing? Of course not. And I don't mean to imply by any way, shape, or form that Catholic congregations are not supportive. I'm just saying that in the aggregate, when I look at my data, that's what happens. Yes?
Krause, your sample involves older persons primarily?
Yes, sir.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So the age effect?
Yes. We could be, that's right. Age is a funny thing in religion, okay? One of the biggest unsolved questions is, do people become more religious as they grow older? Right? And the problem is that how do you answer that question? What a lot of people do is they look at data and they find out that people that are currently older are more involved in religion than people who are presently younger. But we don't know if that's an age effect or a cohort effect, right? To answer that, you got to follow people their whole lives, right? Personally, I feel that you do become more religious as you get older. That's just my guess, my intuitive appeal. And I think part of that is impending death. You know, nobody gets to stay, right? And that means you're going someplace, but you don't know where it is, if you go any place at all. And religion is a thing that at least tries to answer that question for you, at least some faith traditions, right? So, yeah, you know, so now you're saying, well, would this work among younger people? And the answer is, I don't know, but I'm going to find out, all right? And the reason why is this. In fact, I've got this huge study that's in the field right now. I just launched it last month. 3,000 people across the United States. And I broke it down into 1,000 people age 18 to 40, 1,000 people 41 to 64, and 1,000 people 65 and over. And I want to look at exactly to answer your question. Because you know, the thing that's interesting to me is, if you look at the literature on religion, it's got this kind of bimodal distribution, where there's a lot of stuff on adolescents, there's a lot of stuff on older people, but if you look in the Middle Ages, there's much less there. And I don't know why. And I want to find out. Because to me, Middle Age is really kind of a pretty cool time. I mean, having just gone through it. Now I'm officially old though, but I am. I'm 65. But so I'm in my old group now. But yeah, I'd like to find it. So the answer is, are there age effects in my data? I don't know. Very good question to ask. I don't know that anybody can answer that. I haven't seen anything. Yeah.
Dr. Krause, are you concerned that humble people will just naturally deflate how humble they are?
Yeah.
By virtue of them being humble?
Okay, yeah. You know, we got the humility guy right over here, actually, that, you know, Wade sorted a lot of that. And I guess I should have defined humility for you. One of the best definitions I've seen is Tagney, I think it's named Tangney. And she says that a couple of things. One is that humble people have realistic self-perceptions. They know where they stand. And I like that a lot, because I can't imagine Babe Ruth getting up in the morning, looking in the mirror and saying, boy, do I suck at baseball. I just don't think he did that. He knew he was great. The real question about humility is, how do you handle yourself in interpersonal situations? And I think the humble person doesn't need to stand up and say, I'm great. Because if you are, you don't need to say it. People know it. They know it by what you do and what you say.
Yeah, in the book of Romans, St. Paul reinterprets kind of reconcile the classical tradition with the new concept or the new concepts in Christianity.
Yeah.
And he warns against false humility.
That's right.
You know, he says that he's speaking basically saying, some of you want to try to look pious by denying the talents that God has given you. Don't do that. So.
That's right. But now, for those of us who work in the field, it really creates an interesting situation, because you could have genuine humility, but you could have fake humility, hypocrisy, in so many words. And to me, the question is, how many hypocrites are there out there? I don't know. You know, my hunch is not as many as genuinely humble people. That's what I think. But this is why we do empirical research. You know, we got to find these things out. But anyway, did that answer your question?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, good. Yes, ma'am.
Krause, yes, sir. I found it very fascinating about the juxtaposition of those who give social support and those who receive social
Yes,
support
yes.
and the positive effects on health.
Yes.
Are those the same people that are giving social support at a great measure and who are receiving them? I mean, what's the relationship between giving social support and receiving it? Are most people doing both, or?
I think most people are doing both. Yes.
Okay.
And now you get into how do you tease those apart?
Yeah, they're
You know?
correlated, I'm guessing.
They are correlated.
Yeah.
And they're correlated fairly highly, because you would think that people who give and receive support are in active networks that, guess what they do?
Yeah.
They do that, right?
Yeah.
I would still argue that that should work against finding one more important than the other, shouldn't it?
Yes.
But what did the data show?
Better to.
Better yet. So that's partially the answer. I think the real answer, now, you know, if I were a good speaker, I'd cut out right there and just, you know, but you know, I don't have good sense sometimes. There's actually a greater, tougher issue that you've got to evaluate. It's a three-way interaction: giving, receiving, stress. And then you take them all simultaneously, right? So it becomes, but then you get into the correlation between the two. You start to mess things up. So stay tuned. You know, is what I'd say. I'd say there's a list of little stuff there that's helpful, but, you know, I'm not presenting any of this as, you know, this isn't the gospel truth. Wait.
Neil, if you could include any physiological measure, so if you had all the money in the world to get some
Yes.
biomarker,
Yes,
would
yes.
what indicator of health or indicators of health would you be most interested in doing?
You're gonna think I planted this meeting. Because you know why? My nationwide survey has biomarkers in it. All right? We've got hemoglobin A1C, which deals with blood sugar regulation. We tried to get biomarkers. First off, let me stop for a second. I am not a biologist or a physician. My knowledge stops at the leg bones connected to the foot bone, right? You know, but I have a physician on my research team. So she's trying to bring me up to speed as best she can, and I'm giving her more gray hairs than she already has. Anyway, hemoglobin A1C, IL-6, which is a stress hormone, that's in there. You gotta help me out. Epstein-Barr titers,
Oh, Epstein-Barr virus titers, the level of EBV or herpes virus.
Yes.
That's associated with mono.
yes,
That's also associated with stress.
yes, yes, yes. And then we're doing cholesterol, we're doing body weight measured, blood pressure measured, hip waist ratio measured, not self-reported. So we got, and then there's a couple more. Frankly, I forget what they were.
CRP.
Oh yeah, that's right.
C-reactive protein, an indication of inflammation.
Inflammation,
Which is
that's right.
also correlated with stress.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So we're going to start. Okay. Now this study is actually going to be, knock on wood, longitudinal. When it becomes longitudinal, what I'm going to do is supplement this, because you know how hard it is to get biomarkers from 3,000 people coast to coast. Do you know what I mean? And get them to labs in time and get them tested. Whoa. This was a logistic nightmare, but I think we did it. We're going to have a geographically circumscribed area the second time around. New York, Miami, we still haven't decided where it's going to be. We're going to get even more detailed biomarkers there, because they'll be closer to labs and we can do stuff that we couldn't do, you know, nationwide. So the answer is yes. I'm learning. Be patient with me. I'm gonna get after it, because you're absolutely right. You know, we can talk about religions related to health till we're blue in the face, and the only other people going to buy are the people who do work in religion and health. You know, we want to convince people that are not in religion and health, and I think the only way we're going to do that is look. The logic is very simple. If you believe that religion can affect health, then that means religion must be related to biochemical processes in the body. Period. Because if it doesn't do that, it can't be related to health, right? So what we got to do is exactly that. So we're working on it. We're working on it. Have the data in December, and We'll start rolling them out 2015. So, and that's where I'm going first. I'm really high on doing exactly that. So, that's, you can see why I said I'm planning on it, right? I said, wait, and then ask this question. No, I didn't do that.
Dr. Krause?
Yes, sir.
If I may, thanks for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Very persuasive and true to form my experience in the past. You said you want to
Your experiences as?
a pastor.
You're a pastor. Oh, great. I'm really glad to hear that, by the way. I mean,
Oh.
not that you're a pastor, well, that's good. But I mean, I'm glad to see that you found this plausible. That's what I'm saying.
No, more
Okay.
than- More than
Yeah.
plausible, and
Okay.
thanks for the affirmation for being a pastor.
Yeah.
You said you wanted to avoid race early on, just probably sure
Yes.
because of time.
Yes.
But would you give us a highlight or two of things you might have found remarkable?
Yes.
Compared to?
I could tell you, actually, I've done, my big nationwide survey was half white, half black. I came back and got money to do a nationwide survey, but only one wave for Mexican Americans too. So I got basically lined up 3 races, and I've done some analyses on them. What I find is, far and away, by almost any measure of religion you can think of, blacks are more deeply involved in religion than whites. Just across the board. And the question is, why would that be so? And the answer is very simple: history. When blacks first came to America and first started settling their roots in, the church was the only thing that was wholly owned and operated in the black community. Is it any wonder that think about it, every great black leader, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Jesse Jackson, all these guys are pastors, right? Or have very strong religious connections. So it doesn't surprise me at all to see greater involvement there. Mexican Americans are very interesting. They're interesting because I see a split between Mexican Americans who are Catholic and Mexican Americans who are part, as I'm sure you know, the evangelical and the less traditional communities are growing like crazy.
In
In
the
fact,
United States, yeah.
yes, in the United States, that's right.
Not in Mexico.
Yeah, that's right. In the U.S., I'm talking about straight U.S. And yeah, I find very dramatic differences there across those two, where I find less support Catholic, but in the conservative evangelical faith traditions, I find a lot more going on. But that aside, the denominational differences aside, Mexican Americans are much like blacks. They're not quite as involved in religion as blacks, but more so than whites. So that's what, just a thumbnail sketch, that seems to be, what I see. Yeah.
And I just wanted to throw a challenge. I work for the chaplain's office here.
Yes, yes.
And I also have an office in ISR.
Oh, good.
And so, here is just kind of a challenge. There are so many sociologists. This would be an interesting population group, if anybody wants to study, would be college students going on mission trips.
Oh, yeah.
And the effect that it
Yeah.
has, because, I mean,
Right.
the effect it has on the way they live and view, the view and live, embody the virtues.
Yes, yes.
Upon seeing suffering in
Yes,
other places.
yes. Yeah, as you know, there's some faith traditions that require. Require that you go on missionary things, and I think that's great. And yeah, to me, that is certainly a very key form of altruistic behavior, right? It's a key form. Yeah.
So, I know you've done work on negative interactions in the
Yes,
church. Is this
I
a
have.
double-edged sword? Are negative interactions within the church more harmful than negative social interactions, or are they similarly?
That's a very good question, and I'll answer that 2 ways. The first way is, if you read the literature on negative interaction in general, outside religion, the answer is just what you said. The bad things that people do hurt us more than the good things that people do for us. I have not found that in religion. Yes, I found negative interaction does bad things, bad health things, especially mental health things. But I haven't found this geometrically greater effect. It's there, it's harmful, but it doesn't seem to be as harmful. And you say, well, why is that so? And this could be a separate study in itself. I think one of the things that makes it different in religion versus outside in the wider secular world is that in religion, if you run into conflict in your church, what do? You leave, right? But if you're in the secular world and you run into conflict in your family, what do? Not so easy. You know what I mean? And I think, you know, yeah, you can divorce your family, I suppose, but not as easily, you know, as you could switch a congregation, so to speak. So I don't know if that's true, but I'm just saying, you know, these are things when you lay in bed at night and look up at the ceiling and go, what the hell is going on here? You know, and you kind of go, oh yeah, maybe that's the answer. So that's the best I can think about it. Yeah.
So I have one more question about race. So
Sure.
what I know about social epidemiology, that being black is bad for your health, just to kind of put it.
No, that's right. They have higher rates
Right,
of
right.
all kinds of nasty things. Right.
Black people are also, like you're pointing out, they're higher on these all of these scales,
Right.
Measures of religious
Yeah,
involvement.
yeah.
So do you think, and I haven't seen a totally good answer to this question yet, does the higher religious involvement of blacks make a bad situation a little bit better?
Yes.
Or, I mean, if they didn't have that, it would be even worse in them to be black American?
That's what I would think, yes.
Okay.
One of the things that I wanted to do, but I just haven't had to get a chance to do yet, is I want to look at the whole thing about race from the perspective of discrimination and prejudice. Does religion help people deal with discrimination and prejudice? There's some things out there, but not, I think, a really good, you know, let's get down and get into the real nitty-gritty of this. And I know that when people talk about discrimination, they typically talk about you personally. What have you experienced? Has somebody not rent your apartment even though it was available? That kind of stuff. But I was actually gearing up to do this kind of study to get funded. Oh well. And you know, we've got some of those too. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to look at something called historical discrimination. And the argument was, you know, I personally can feel discrimination, and that's bad. But I think it's worse when you say, and this is what happened to my father, and my father's father, and his father. And I just think if you view that discriminatory act in that wider historical context, it makes it even more pernicious, is what I think. So, you know, let's go back. Does it make life better? I think it does. Does it level the playing field? You already know the answer. But I think, what specifically does it help with? And that's the kind of thing I love to.
Or maybe there's something specific about their religious involvement that might be unique to their kind of unique circumstances.
Yeah. Okay.
We have to wrap up. I want to thank Neil.
Thank you.
Let's